Hello, hello. Today is Water Day. So we know that there is no better way for children to learn about the properties of liquid, to learn big science concepts like evaporation, density, to practice fine motor control, than to be playing with water. So I am Nicole Dravillas Frabel. This is Wildwood Teaching. And every once in a while, I take a natural material and I kind of go through the different ways that you can use it to teach preschool. Today's material is water. Now, before I go into the different ways, there are some things to keep in mind. Now, everything that I do here at Wildwood Teaching, that I do when I am teaching at my own preschool, Wildwood Nature School, is built upon what I call the Nature Pathways Blueprint. It's kind of three big concepts that when I am, deciding what to do with the preschoolers, I make sure that I fit within those concepts. The first one is co-constructed learning. The second one is use of natural materials. And the third one is the consideration of our learning environment. And so today we are mainly going to be focused on using natural materials, a particular natural material, water. But it is important that you keep the idea of co-constructed learning in your mind so that when you are introducing these ideas to children, they aren't just activities. They are coming from you observing an interest in children, and I'll describe some of that as I go through and how I approach these activities with children, or that you are setting it up in such a way that you are allowing children to put their own stamp on it to show you how they are interested in using the materials. The other thing you want to keep in mind here is that, when I describe them to you, I might say, this is a science idea. This is an art idea. But in reality, anytime you're using water, you're exploring the properties of liquid. So it's all a science idea, right? So when children approach things, there is overlap, right? They're going to be using the small muscles in their hand to be doing some of the things so that it is also a fine motor activity. So it's demarcated for us as teachers, so that we can kind of think about what are the goals of what we're doing. But, where it fits when your children actually approach these ideas may be completely different from one setting to the next, from one group of children to the next. All right, so disclaimers aside, let's get into it. I'm going to kind of tilt my screen so that you can see. I have a tray of water. And I've done this before where children either, we're doing it maybe as a group exploration, and each child or each two or three children have their own water. I've also set it up at our sensory table, the mud kitchen water table that you kind of see behind me, where it's just children, go as they're interested. It just kind of depends on how many children have expressed interest. Am I going from a question that we wanted to explore as a group and experiment, or is this more of an initial stage thing where I'm just kind of seeing where the children are going with it? Okay, so what I want to encourage you to do, we all know about sink and float. That happens. And in fact, when I was teaching first grade, the other first grade teachers would say, well, I'm not going to do sink and float because by the time they get to first grade, they've already done sink or float 30 times. And it's not even an experiment because they know what's going to happen. So if that's true of your children, there are some ways to go beyond sink and float. And so one of the things that my kids noticed at one point was that they could float a leaf. So that some things sink, some things float, but can you make something float that wouldn't necessarily float otherwise? So, what happens if you stick a pebble on your leaf boat? How many pebbles can you stick on before it does sink to the bottom? Right? You might want to make your own boat. Right? This is Sculpey clay. And the reason I use Sculpey clay rather than Play Doh or um, regular clay is that Sculpey clay is an air dry clay, which means it's not going to disintegrate in the water. And so the kids can kind of play around with shape, right? What happens if you make your boat flat? What happens if you make your boat concave? And does the shape matter? Right? You can also explore density, right? So I have a collection of balls, right? From ping pong balls to golf balls, from something that was in a sort of building set, right? Um, I would find one, if it were me, that had this exact same size, right? Ooh, what happens when it has the holes in it, as opposed to when it's that same size, but a light ball filled with air, right? So you're exploring, how do the holes make a difference, right? I've got my ping pong ball, I've got this wiffle ball with holes in it, and they're about the same size. Um, But what is different about how one floats, one doesn't? And they probably feel like they're about the same weight. So it's a different way to explore what happens with sink or float. You can also explore porosity and absorption by using sponges or cotton balls or different kinds of fabric or different kinds of paper. What if you have glossy paper that you rolled into a ball as opposed to newspaper that you roll into a ball? Or instead of dunking it, you can use your handy eyedropper, right, to drop the water onto the pages. And we actually did this with my group once. Um, they had just started, using sponges. They were kind of cleaning the water table every once in a while. They like to clean the water table. And they were noticing what happens when they use a cloth versus when they use a sponge versus when they use a toothbrush or a scrub brush that we have in the uh, already in the mud kitchen area. And so they actually took this to a full-on experiment where different children took different materials and they kind of talked about whether the water spread out, whether it went into the substance, whether the substance felt wet afterwards, whether their paper, their fabric felt wet afterwards, whether the water completely disappeared and they couldn't see it anymore. Um, and I should say that the density experiment happens when, or this is a density and water displacement experiment. It happened when two of the children took an empty aluminum bottle and they were pushing it down into the water and then giggling as it popped right back up. And then they would push it right back down again and giggle as it popped back up. And then they started experimenting. What if they filled that bottle with water and tried to push a funnel down into it? Would it pop back up? And so that is how our experiment was based on the children's interest. So you can do density experiments by taking water and watching it displace, right? What happens when you put something in water? What happens when you take it back out to the water level, right? So math, you can obviously bring a whole bunch of measuring cups to the your water area. filling, dumping. Like I said, there's the fine motor overlap. There's also the science overlap when you're talking about what happens to the shape of the container. What happens if I fill this container and the water goes up high and I put it in a wider container and maybe the water level isn't as high? Or maybe I am noticing the numbers on the side and actually measuring the cup. You could also do what I call disappearing numbers, right? Um, and that is just for a teacher or another child to write a number on a chalkboard. And then we get a little paintbrush wet, and you can make them disappear by painting over the numbers. It is helpful if you do want children to learn the vocabulary of numbers to be talking about the numbers while you're doing it, right? And also to encourage the children to follow the lines. So I mean, you can certainly do it this way, 4, and I'm just erasing straight away. But um, it is helpful if you tell the child, rather than going right across it, try to follow the lines. How many times do you have to follow the lines before your number 3 disappears? Is it 3 times because it's a 3? Or is it more than that? You can also stamp shapes. So I have a little circle here. Just like anytime you're doing stamping, you don't want to do overload. So if you've ever done like a leaf print, you know that if the children blop it with a lot of paint, takes a while till they blop the paint off for it to actually make a print. So, if you're putting the circle in the water, you want to have the children shake it or run to another part of the schoolyard before they make a print. But they're just going to press it on, and you can see that I have a circle here. You can use commercial stampers, or children can experiment with natural objects and see what kind of shape their bottom or their sides make when you are making that print. Now, of course, just like you did the disappearing numbers, you can bring that to literacy and do disappearing letters. I think this is also a great opportunity to introduce new vocabulary. So all of the vocabulary that I used when I was introducing the science ideas to you are ones that you can introduce to children. Absorption, porosity, density. You can talk also about shallow and deep. We learned that in my preschool when we were talking about the creek that we have here at the forest and it's changing water levels. You can talk about, making a dam. You can talk about flooding, right? So introduce all of those vocabulary words. And that is also, I think sometimes teachers wonder, what am I supposed to be doing when the children are just playing? And I'm just observing. Well, in addition to taking your notes, you can be talking to the children. Oh, I noticed that. It looks like the water's overflowing. Oh my gosh, there is a flood. How much more water do we have to add to it to make it overflow? So putting the vocabulary to their play that they're already doing. All right, I am going to move my water table and we're going to talk about some art. And so I would say for art, get out your spray bottles so that you can experiment with water and how it flows. So one thing that is fun to do is to take tissue paper squares, and you can have them pre-torn like I do. I just have a bunch pre-torn, or children can have fun tearing them. I have a little wind issue here, but that's okay. Once children have their design, right? They're going to squirt it with the water. If they haven't finished their design and they had to squirt it anyway to get it to not to blow away in the winds, which also is an interesting science idea to talk about. Um, Heavier things not blowing away, right? Once you have it completely squirted with water, you're going to want to put this outside in the sun. And hopefully, you've bought the cheap tissue paper that fades. And so, as the tissue paper sits in the sun, the colors from the tissue paper are going to sink into the paper, and then you will be able to remove the the paper and the tissue paper and the colors will be left behind. Another way to leave color on your paper is if you still have powdered tempera paints, or I have vegetable powders that I mix into paints, so that we have safe for the kids, safe for the environment paints. But those powders are really good for the children to sprinkle all over the paper. And then again, squirt with water, and the color, you don't have to set it out in the sun, the color will instantly spread out onto the paper. Another idea is to, oh my, hang on, my tray is filled with water here. There we go. Uh, so another idea is to do negative prints. So in that case, you would uh, tape your leaf onto the paper. Now my hands are wet. Just rolling the tape onto the back of the paper. Again, fine motor, right? Do the children know how to roll tape? Now, if children were doing this, we probably would encourage them to arrange a whole bunch of leaves on the paper. Um, and then they're gonna take watercolors. I usually have them place the leaf and the paper on the ground and have them stand over it. If they get too close, it doesn't speckle. Um, you just get too much watercolor on it, but they're going to spray their whole paper. They can have different color water papers, but the idea is to get your whole paper covered with the paint and then let it dry, remove the leaves, and you are left with that negative print. All right, so like I said in the beginning, take some time, observe your children, think about what they might be interested in, think about what they are ready to learn, and then try some of these ideas. Be willing to take it where it goes. When you or the children have some ideas and some interest, and then join me here next week when I will be talking about a book list of water themed books that you might use in conjunction with some of these activities. I will see you there.